I scrubbed the floors of my own company while my husband laughed with his mistress upstairs. She called me filth, kicked dirty water into my face, and threatened to fire me. What she didn't know was that every light above her head, every chair she sat on, every dollar she spent belonged to me. That day, I didn't just clean an office. I exposed a marriage, a betrayal, and two people who mistook silence for weakness. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I never imagined I would one day stand in the lobby of my father's company wearing cracked shoes and a faded cleaning uniform, pretending I didn't belong there. The marble floors beneath my feet had once echoed with my heels as I walked beside him, a proud daughter learning the weight of legacy. That morning, they felt cold, unfamiliar, almost accusatory. I kept my head down, fingers tight around the handle of a mop, and reminded myself why I was there. Numbers don't lie, my father used to say. People do. And the numbers had been screaming for months. My name is Elena. On paper, I am the chairwoman of a multinational firm my father built from nothing but stubborn faith and sleepless nights. In private, I am a wife who trusted her husband too easily. David had come into my life like a breath of calm, charming, attentive, always ready with reassurance when the boardroom felt too heavy. After my father's passing, I leaned on David more than I should have. I let him handle the day-to-day operations while I focused on long-term strategy and international expansion. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was ignoring the quiet alarms. Profits dipped in divisions that had always been steady. Long-time employees, people who had worked with my father for decades, started submitting resignations with vague explanations, personal reasons, a better opportunity. When I called them, voices trembled, words were careful. Something was wrong, and everyone knew it except me. Or maybe I knew it and didn't want to admit it. I asked David directly one evening over dinner. He smiled, reached for my hand, and told me I was overthinking. Markets fluctuate, people move on. He said my father had been brilliant, but times were changing. I wanted to believe him. Love makes liars of us all. Still, that night, I opened the internal audit reports myself. What I found made my stomach drop. Unauthorized approvals, budgets rerouted, entire departments suddenly reporting to a special consultant whose name kept appearing in emails I'd never been copied on. Sophia. The name lingered in my mind like a bad taste. When I asked David who Sophia was, he shrugged too quickly. A contractor, a fresh perspective, someone who knew how to motivate people. I nodded, but my trust cracked. I needed the truth, and I knew how power works in places like this. People perform for the top. Fear and loyalty warp the story before it reaches the chairwoman's desk. If I wanted honesty, I needed to go where no one filtered their words. The ground floor, the back halls, the places people think no one important listens. So I became Maria. I dyed my hair a dull brown and tied it back. I left my jewelry at home, slipped into clothes that smelled faintly of bleach, and practiced shrinking my presence in the mirror. It was harder than I expected. I had been taught to stand tall, to meet eyes, to speak with certainty. Now I rehearsed silence. At dawn, I entered my own building through the service entrance, heart pounding as if I were committing a crime. The security guard barely glanced at me. That hurt more than I expected. Invisibility is a lesson you never forget. The first hours were a blur of routine, emptying trash, wiping fingerprints from glass, listening. Offices are honest places when people think you're part of the furniture. I heard whispers about sudden firings, about a woman on the executive floor who acted like she owned the place. I heard my husband's laughter through walls as he passed by with her, their voices too close, too familiar. Each sound pressed into me like a bruise. Sophia arrived mid-morning in a wave of perfume and heels that clicked like punctuation marks. She was younger than me, sharper at the edges, dressed in confidence she hadn't earned. People straightened when she entered, not out of respect, but fear. I watched from the corner as she berated an assistant for a typo, her words cutting and public. David stood beside her, amused, indulgent, the way one indulges a child throwing a tantrum. That was the moment something in me went very still. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet realization that the person you trusted is enjoying your humiliation. By noon, my hands were raw and my resolve was iron. I saw an elderly manager, Mr. Alvarez, who had once taught me how to read balance sheets, called into a glass office and dismissed for a minor oversight. He walked out pale, shoulders bowed, clutching a box with twiddling hands. Sophia's laughter followed him. I wanted to scream. Instead, I scrubbed harder, memorizing faces, dates, behaviors. Every insult, every abuse of authority was another brick in the case I was building. When Sophia's eyes finally landed on me, it wasn't curiosity. It was irritation. I had looked at her too long. She stepped closer, surveyed me like dirt on her shoe, and smiled thinly. I lowered my gaze, heart hammering, and waited. This was the moment I had come for, even if I didn't know it yet. I didn't know how far she would go, or how much it would cost me to let her. I only knew one thing as I dipped the mop back into the bucket. The truth was already out, circling us both, and soon it would land. The afternoon settled into the building like a held breath. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and beneath it all ran a current of tension I could almost taste. I moved quietly, cleaning conference rooms I had once chaired, wiping whiteboards still marked with strategies I had approved months earlier. Every familiar detail felt distorted through the lens of my disguise, as if I were walking through a memory that no longer belonged to me. Sophia's presence grew heavier as the hours passed. She drifted from office to office, issuing commands that contradicted established procedures, dismissing concerns with a flick of her manicured hand. People nodded, apologized, complied. Fear is efficient that way. I noticed how David trailed behind her, sometimes whispering, sometimes laughing, never once questioning her authority. Each shared glance between them was a small betrayal, and together they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. Late in the afternoon, I was cleaning near the executive wing when I heard raised voices. Sophia was arguing with a department head, a woman named Clara who had been with the company nearly as long as my father. Clara's voice was calm but firm, insisting that a proposed transfer of funds violated compliance rules. Sophia scoffed, accused her of being outdated, resistant to change. David intervened then, not to support Clara, but to side with Sophia, telling Clara she needed to be a team player or reconsider her future here. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Clara nodded slowly, eyes shining, and left the room without another word. I felt something inside me crack cleanly in two. As I scrubbed the floor outside that office, I remembered Clara holding my hand at my father's funeral, promising she would help me protect his legacy. Now she was being pushed out by a woman who treated the company like a personal playground. The injustice burned, but I forced myself to stay in character. Maria didn't cry. Maria cleaned. Sophia noticed me again when I paused too long near the doorway. Our eyes met briefly and her lips curled. She sauntered over, heels sharp against the tile, and stopped inches from me. I could smell her perfume, hear her breath. "Did I tell you to stand there?" she snapped. I shook my head, murmured an apology, and bent back to my work. She lingered, watching me with something like amusement, then kicked the bucket. Dirty water sloshed out, soaking my shoes and splattering my skirt. A few nearby employees gasped. Sophia laughed. "Useless," she said loudly. "Clean it properly, you filth, or I'll fire you right now." The words echoed off the walls, heavy and humiliating. For a split second, instinct urged me to react, to straighten, to command silence. Instead, I breathed. This was the proof I needed. This was who they were when they thought no one important was watching. I knelt, wiping water from the floor with shaking hands that were only partly acting. The humiliation was real, but so was my resolve. As I stood, something shifted. I wiped my face slowly, meeting Sophia's eyes again, and felt the mask loosen. My posture changed. My voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "You cannot fire me," I said quietly, "because the chair you are sitting on, I bought it this morning. In fact, I own this entire building." The hallway went silent. Sophia stared at me, confused, then laughed sharply, as if indulging a joke. David's face drained of color. He knew that voice. He knew that cadence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping once. Screens in the lobby flickered to life, displaying security footage, David and Sophia together in his office, accounts open on his computer, transfers highlighted. Gasps rippled through the building. Security guards stepped forward, nodding respectfully to me. I straightened fully now, shedding Maria like an old skin. David stammered my name. Sophia backed away, fury turning to fear. I handed David a set of papers, divorce filings already signed. To Sophia, I passed a folder detailing every unauthorized transaction she'd approved, every policy she'd violated. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers and accounting." Security moved in, escorting them both toward the exit as whispers followed. As they were dragged away, I looked around at the stunned faces of my employees. "I wanted to clean this office," I said softly. "I started by taking out the trash." The doors closed behind them, and the building exhaled. In the quiet that followed, I felt the weight lift, not just from the company, but from my heart. The truth had cost me my marriage, but it had saved my father's legacy. And as I stood there, no longer invisible, I knew this was only the beginning of reckoning and repair. The silence after they were taken away was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that building. It wasn't empty, it was reverent, heavy with realization. People stood frozen in place, some with hands over their mouths, others staring at the floor as if afraid to meet my eyes. I could feel the shift in the air, the collective understanding that something fundamental had changed. Power had re-entered the room, and it wasn't cruel or loud. It was quiet, controlled, and watching. I took a slow breath and reminded myself that this moment wasn't about spectacle, it was about restoration. I asked everyone to return to their desks, my voice steady but gentle, and assured them that there would be no retaliation for speaking up, no punishment for fear-driven silence. Fear thrives in uncertainty. I needed to remove it. As people dispersed, hesitant but relieved, a few approached me with trembling smiles, whispered apologies for not warning me sooner. I touched their arms, told them they were safe now, and I meant it. That evening, after the building emptied, I walked through the halls alone. The cleaning uniform lay folded in my office, a strange relic of a day that felt like a lifetime. I sank into my father's old chair and let myself feel everything I had held back: grief, rage, disappointment, and an unexpected sense of relief. The marriage I thought I had was gone, but so was the illusion that had been slowly poisoning my life. Sometimes the truth arrives like a storm. It destroys, but it also clears the air. The days that followed were a blur of action. I convened emergency board meetings, reinstated managers who had been unfairly dismissed, and froze accounts pending a full forensic audit. Emails poured in from employees sharing stories they'd been too afraid to tell. Each one reinforced the same lesson: abuse of power flourishes when good people are silenced. I answered every message personally, not as a chairwoman hiding behind an assistant, but as Alina, a steward of something larger than herself. David tried to contact me repeatedly. His messages swung wildly between apology and accusation, love and resentment. I didn't respond. The man I had loved was someone I no longer recognized, or perhaps someone I had never truly known. The divorce moved swiftly. Evidence has a way of cutting through denial. Sophia's lawyers attempted bluster, but facts are stubborn things. The funds were recovered. Charges were filed. The queen of the office learned what it meant to answer for her arrogance. One afternoon, Clara knocked on my door. She looked tired but hopeful, carrying the same calm strength I remembered from my childhood. We talked for hours, not about revenge or humiliation, but about rebuilding trust. She reminded me that my father's greatest pride hadn't been profit margins or acquisitions. It had been people. "You remembered that," she said quietly. I smiled, feeling his presence in the room, approving. As weeks turned into months, the company stabilized, morale improved. The whispers of fear were replaced with cautious optimism. I implemented new oversight policies, transparent reporting channels, and anonymous protections for whistleblowers. I wanted a culture where no one needed to disguise themselves to be heard. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had gone undercover to save the truth, and in doing so, I had learned how deeply visibility matters. Personally, healing was slower. At night, alone in a house that felt too big, I replayed memories, moments I had dismissed, signs I had ignored. I learned to forgive myself for trusting, for loving. Vulnerability isn't weakness, I realized. Staying blind to protect comfort is. Each morning, I chose to show up anyway, scars and all. One day, as I walked through the lobby, a young cleaner smiled at me. "Good morning, Miss Elena," she said. I stopped, thanked her by name, and asked how her day was going. Her surprise mirrored my own from weeks earlier. In that exchange, something closed gently inside me, a circle completed. I entered my own company invisible and left it seen, not just as a chairwoman, but as a woman who had faced betrayal and refused to become bitter. Power, I learned, isn't about dominance. It's about responsibility. And dignity belongs to everyone, no matter the uniform they wear. The true aftermath of betrayal doesn't arrive with shouting or headlines. It settles in quietly, in the spaces where certainty used to live. For me, it arrived in the mornings, when I woke reaching for a phone I no longer checked for his messages, and in the evenings, when the echo of my footsteps through the house reminded me I was finally alone with myself. I threw myself into work not to escape the pain, but to anchor myself to something real. Structure has always been my refuge. The audit uncovered more than I expected. David hadn't just been careless or manipulated, he had been complicit. The affair and the theft were intertwined, each feeding the other. He had authorized Sophia to override protocols, to intimidate dissenters, to redirect contracts to shell companies she controlled. In exchange, she fed his ego, praised his vision, made him feel powerful in ways he never had beside me. Reading the reports was like watching a slow-motion collapse of the man I had loved. There was no single villain, just a series of choices made without integrity. I met with the employees most affected one by one. Some cried as they spoke. Others were stoic, anger buried under professionalism. I listened. I apologized, not because the harm was mine alone, but because leadership carries responsibility even when others abuse it. I reinstated positions, offered compensation where possible, and made a promise I intended to keep. This would never happen again under my watch. Trust is rebuilt through action, not speeches. The press eventually caught wind of the scandal. Headlines were less kind than my boardroom had been. "Chairwoman exposes cheating husband," they wrote, as if the betrayal were entertainment. I declined interviews. I refused to let my pain become a spectacle. The company issued a measured statement focused on governance and reform. Privately, I learned how to breathe through judgment that had nothing to do with truth. Public narratives are blunt instruments. I chose not to be shaped by them. David appeared in court smaller than I remembered. He avoided my eyes. His confidence evaporated. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he spoke of pressure, of temptation, of feeling overshadowed. I felt a flicker of pity, and then it passed. Accountability isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The gavel fell, and with it, the last illusion of us. Sophia's downfall was louder. She raged, denied, blamed everyone but herself. Watching her unravel was not satisfying in the way people imagine revenge to be. It was instructive. Arrogance collapses inward when it meets consequence. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had done its work. Outside the company, I began to reclaim parts of myself I had neglected. I returned to painting, something I'd loved before boardrooms consumed my time. I reconnected with friends I had sidelined for a marriage that demanded too much accommodation. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it. Healing isn't linear. Some days were light, others felt heavy for no clear reason. I allowed both. One evening, Clara invited me to a small gathering of retirees, people who had worked with my father in the early days. They told stories I'd never heard, laughed at old mistakes, spoke of values that had guided them when there was no money, no recognition, just belief. I realized then that legacy isn't preserved by control, it's preserved by memory and shared purpose. I had been given a chance not just to protect what my father built, but to honor how he built it. Back at the office, I instituted leadership training focused on empathy and ethics. Promotions were tied not only to results, but to conduct. I wanted a culture where success didn't excuse abuse, where ambition didn't excuse abuse. Change met resistance, as it always does, but it also met relief. People are tired of pretending harm is the price of progress. Late one night, I found the old cleaning uniform in my closet. I held it for a long moment, remembering the sting of dirty water, the weight of silence. I didn't throw it away. I folded it carefully and placed it in a box. It was a reminder, not of humiliation, but of clarity, of the day I chose truth over comfort. I had gone undercover to catch a cheater. I emerged having confronted something deeper, my own willingness to be underestimated to uncover what mattered. And in that, I found a steadier kind of strength, one that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. Time has a way of revealing what survives after the noise fades. Months passed, and the scandal that once dominated whispers became a lesson folded quietly into the company's history. For me, it became a marker, a clear line between who I had been and who I was becoming. I no longer measured my worth by proximity to someone else's approval. I measured it by alignment with my values. The company's recovery wasn't just financial, it was cultural. Departments that had been pitted against each other began collaborating again. People spoke more freely in meetings, challenged ideas without fear of reprisal. I made it a point to attend town halls without entourage or script, answering difficult questions honestly. Transparency is uncomfortable, but it breeds respect. I learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating space where the truth can surface without punishment. One afternoon, I received a letter from Mr. Alvarez. He thanked me for reinstating his pension and restoring his dignity. He wrote about the shame he had felt carrying that box out of the building and the relief he felt knowing it hadn't been his failure. I read the letter twice, then framed it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the human cost of silence. That day, I announced a mentorship program pairing senior employees with younger staff. Knowledge, like trust, grows when it's shared. Privately, I continued therapy. Betrayal leaves patterns in the mind, hypervigilance, self-doubt, a tendency to replay moments searching for missed clues. I learned to interrupt those loops with compassion. My therapist asked me once what I would tell a friend who had lived my story. The answer came easily. I deserve the same kindness. David's presence in my life dwindled to legal correspondence and distant memories. Occasionally, something would trigger a flash of grief, the way he used to take his coffee, a song we once loved. I let the feeling pass without judgment. Love doesn't vanish cleanly, it transforms, then fades. I didn't need to harden my heart to move forward. At work, a young analyst named Priya approached me after a meeting. She told me she had almost quit during Sophia's reign, convinced her voice didn't matter. "Seeing you stand there that day," she said softly, "it changed how I see myself." Her words humbled me. Representation isn't abstract, it's lived. I had become a reference point not because I sought it, but because I acted when it counted. I began speaking occasionally at industry forums, not about my marriage, but about governance, ethics, and the invisible labor that keeps organizations honest. I spoke about listening to the margins, about how easily power corrodes when left unchecked. After one talk, a woman pulled me aside and whispered, "I thought I was alone." That sentence stayed with me. Silence isolates, truth connects. One quiet evening, I returned to the building after hours. The lights glowed softly, cleaners moving methodically through the halls. I greeted them by name, thanked them for their work. One laughed, embarrassed, and said no one had ever done that before. I remembered my first day as Maria and felt a swell of resolve. Dignity is not a perp of status, it's a baseline. As I stood by the window overlooking the city, I thought about the moment Sophia kicked that bucket, about the choice I made to stand up slowly and speak the truth. Courage, I realized, isn't impulsive, it's deliberate. It waits for the right moment, then acts without cruelty. Revenge would have been easy. Justice required restraint. I had cleaned the office, yes, but more importantly, I had cleaned my life of illusions. I no longer needed to prove my worth through endurance of disrespect. I had learned to trust myself again. And that trust, quiet, earned, unshakable, was the real inheritance my father had left me. There comes a point after upheaval when life doesn't announce that it's moving forward. It simply does. One morning, you realize you slept through the night without waking from the same memory. One afternoon, you laugh without immediately wondering if it's inappropriate. Healing, I learned, is subtle. It doesn't ask permission. It happens while you're busy rebuilding. By the time a year had passed, the company had not only stabilized, but grown. New partnerships formed, ones grounded in transparency and shared values rather than flashy promises. Investors who had once questioned my leadership now spoke of it with measured respect. I didn't relish their approval the way I might have once. I had learned how conditional it can be. What mattered more were the internal shifts, the way people held themselves, the way meetings felt less performative and more honest. I instituted a practice I called ground reviews. Once a quarter, I would spend an entire day shadowing different departments without prior notice. No cameras, no announcements, just observation and conversation. I listened more than I spoke. It wasn't about catching anyone doing something wrong. It was about understanding how policies translated into lived experience. The cleaners were always on my list. They taught me things no executive report ever could. At home, the house slowly became mine again. I redecorated, not to erase the past, but to reclaim space. I donated furniture that held too much weight, replaced it with pieces chosen deliberately, patiently. I cooked more. I hosted friends. I learned that solitude isn't loneliness when it's chosen. It's rest. Occasionally, news of David surfaced through mutual acquaintances. He was trying to rebuild his career, struggling under the shadow of his own actions. I felt no satisfaction in that. Consequences don't need witnesses to be real. I wished him clarity and distance, nothing more. Closure, I discovered, is not a conversation. It's a decision. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a business school. The topic was leadership under pressure. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces full of ambition and uncertainty, I spoke not about dominance or resilience in the abstract, but about accountability when no one is watching. I told them that titles are temporary, but integrity leaves a residue. It clings. It shapes rooms long after you leave them. When I finished, there was a long pause before the applause. That pause meant more to me than the sound that followed. Later that week, Clara retired. We held a small ceremony in the atrium. She hugged me tightly and whispered that my father would be proud. I believed her. Pride, I realized, isn't loud. It's steady. It shows up in the decisions you make when it would be easier not to. I continued therapy, though less frequently. We spoke about trust, how to rebuild it without naivety. I learned to distinguish between intuition and fear, between boundaries and walls. I began dating cautiously, honestly, with no urgency to define outcomes. I was no longer trying to fill a void. I was sharing space. One evening, as I reviewed old files, I came across an early photo of my father in the original office. Bare walls, borrowed desks, hope written plainly on his face. I placed the photo on my desk. It grounded me. Success can be intoxicating. Memory keeps it humane. The cleaning uniform box remained in my closet. I never opened it, but I knew it was there, not as a relic of pain, but as proof of choice, of the day I trusted myself enough to step into discomfort and speak the truth calmly. That mattered more than any public vindication. Looking back, I understood something I hadn't then. The humiliation wasn't the water on my face. It was the assumption that I would accept it silently. The moment I stood up wasn't about revealing my identity. It was about refusing erasure. Power had tried to shrink me. I expanded instead. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. And honesty, I found, is sustainable. It carries you forward without requiring performance. As I locked my office late one night, city lights reflecting in the glass, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. I had done what needed to be done. The rest would unfold in its own time. There is a moment, after everything has been exposed and repaired, when you're left alone with the simplest question of all: who am I now? Not as a wife, not as a daughter carrying a legacy, not even as a chairwoman navigating expectations, but as a woman who has seen behind the curtain and chosen not to look away. That question followed me quietly, not urgently, as life continued to move forward. It surfaced one morning as I watched the sunrise from my kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hands. For years, my mornings had been shaped by urgency, emails, meetings, crises waiting to be solved. That day, there was none of that, just light creeping across the floor and the realization that peace felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I smiled at myself then. Growth often feels strange before it feels natural. At work, the company entered a new phase. We launched initiatives my father had once dreamed about but never had the resources to pursue: community partnerships, ethical supply chains, scholarships for employees' children. These weren't public relations gestures, they were commitments. I wanted success that could look itself in the mirror without flinching. Each decision felt like placing a stone carefully, building something meant to last. Employees began sharing stories of small changes that meant everything to them. A manager who listened instead of dismissed, a policy that allowed flexibility during illness, a sense that the company saw them as human beings, not expendable parts. These weren't dramatic victories, but they were real, and they mattered more than any headline ever had. Personally, I found myself revisiting memories I had avoided, not the betrayal itself, but the years before it, the woman I had been when love felt safe and uncomplicated. I realized I didn't want to erase that version of myself. She had loved sincerely. That wasn't foolishness. That was courage without armor. I honored her by not letting bitterness rewrite her story. One evening, while sorting through old documents at home, I found my wedding album tucked away in a drawer. I sat on the floor and opened it slowly. The woman smiling back at me looked hopeful, grounded, unaware of what lay ahead. I didn't feel anger. I felt tenderness. For a moment, I let myself grieve, not for the man I lost, but for the future I had imagined. Then I closed the album and placed it back, gently. Some chapters don't need to be reread to be understood. Around that time, a new challenge emerged at the company, not a scandal, but a crossroads. An acquisition opportunity promised massive profits, but came with ethical compromises I couldn't ignore. Advisors were divided. Some urged me to be pragmatic, others warned of reputational risk. I listened, weighed the data, and then chose to walk away. The silence after my decision was telling. I knew then that leadership wasn't about consensus, it was about coherence. My values and my actions needed to match, even when it cost us something measurable. That decision earned me something harder to quantify: trust. Not the fragile kind that depends on charm, but the durable kind that grows from consistency. People knew where I stood, and in that clarity, they found their footing too. Late one afternoon, as I prepared to leave the office, I passed by the janitorial supply room. The door was open, laughter spilling out as a small group took a break. For a moment, I stood there unseen, listening. It reminded me of my first day as Maria, of how much truth lives in the margins. I stepped inside, joined them briefly, thanked them for their work. One of them joked that I was the only boss who knew where the extra mops were kept. We laughed together. It was ordinary, and it was perfect. That night, I sat alone with a notebook and wrote down what the past year had taught me. Not lessons for a speech or a book, just truths for myself. That silence can be strategic, but it should never be permanent. That dignity doesn't ask permission. That love without respect is not love. And that power, when held with humility, can heal instead of harm. As I closed the notebook, I felt a sense of readiness, Not for revenge, not for validation, but for closure. The story that had begun with humiliation and betrayal was nearing its end. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been integrated. It no longer defined me, it informed me. There was one last thing I needed to do, one final step, not dramatic, not public, but deeply personal. And I knew, as I turned off the light and prepared for sleep, that this final act would mark the true end of the journey, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. The final step I needed to take wasn't something anyone else would notice. There would be no announcement, no applause, no visible marker of completion. It was quiet, almost deceptively simple, and yet it mattered more than all the confrontations and courtrooms combined. On a clear Saturday morning, I returned to the building alone. No security detail, no assistance. The city outside was still half asleep, the streets calm in a way they rarely were during the week. Inside, the lobby lights glowed softly, reflecting off the same marble floors I had once scrubbed on my knees. I stood there for a long moment, letting memory and present reality overlap without flinching. I walked to my office, unlocked a drawer, and took out the box I had carried with me for over a year, the cleaning uniform. I unfolded it slowly, running my fingers over the worn fabric. I remembered the weight of the mop, the sting of cold water on my skin, the way people looked through me instead of at me. I also remembered the moment I stood up, not in anger, not in revenge, but in certainty. I didn't keep the uniform as a symbol of suffering. I kept it as evidence of truth, of who I was when stripped of title and protection, of the strength that didn't rely on recognition. That morning, I carried the uniform down to the building's small archive room, where we kept objects from the company's earliest days, old ledgers, photographs, handwritten notes from my father. I placed the folded uniform in a simple box and labeled it plainly, not with my name, not with a dramatic description, just the date. Some things don't need explanation, they need remembrance. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked different than I had years ago. Not harder, clearer. Betrayal has a way of sanding down illusions, leaving you with what's solid underneath. I saw a woman who no longer confused tolerance for kindness or silence for grace. I saw someone who knew the cost of looking away and had chosen not to. Later that week, I met with the full staff in the atrium. It wasn't mandatory, but nearly everyone came. I didn't recount the scandal. I didn't name names. I spoke instead about dignity, about how every role in the company mattered, and how power would never again be used to humiliate or erase. I told them I had failed once by being too distant, too trusting without verification, and that I would not make that mistake again. When I finished, there was no dramatic applause, just nods, relief, a sense of shared ownership. That was enough. In my personal life, closure arrived gently. I finalized the sale of the house I had once shared with David. I walked through each room one last time, thanking the memories that had been real and releasing the ones that no longer belonged to me. I didn't rush. Letting go deserves time. I moved into a smaller place overlooking a park. Mornings there were filled with birdsong instead of notifications. I hosted dinners with friends who had known me before the betrayal and those who had met me after. Both versions of me sat at the table comfortably now. I didn't need to choose between them. Occasionally, someone would recognize me in public and ask about that day, the day the cleaner revealed she owned the company. They expected a sharp answer, a triumphant smile. I gave them something quieter. I told them it wasn't about humiliating anyone, it was about ending a lie. Because the truth is this: humiliation wasn't my victory, integrity was. The mistress faded into irrelevance, the husband became a closed chapter. What remained was something far more valuable: a life aligned with itself, a leadership style rooted in accountability, a heart that had learned how to trust without surrendering discernment. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, I sat on my balcony and thought of my father, of how he had taught me that character shows most clearly when no one is watching. I wished I could tell him how close I had come to losing that lesson and how fiercely I had reclaimed it. I imagined him smiling, not because I had won, but because I had chosen rightly. If there is a moral to my story, it isn't that power always reveals the truth, it's that humility does. When you're willing to step down, to listen from the ground level, to endure discomfort for clarity, you learn who people really are, including yourself. I once went undercover to expose betrayal. I emerged with something better than revenge. I emerged with self-respect intact, a legacy restored, and a future no longer built on illusion. And that is how my story ends. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with peace, earned, steady, and finally my own.